last movie, I talked about how to make a gradient swatch in the swatch panel. Now let's look at applying gradients to stuff on your page, and then how to fine-tune those gradients. Because I'm starting off with a document, I don't have any gradients in my swatches panel right now, so I'm going to go ahead and create one. I'll select an object, say New Gradient Swatch, and click OK. Then I'll edit that gradient swatch so I can see what I'm doing. I'll go from, let's say, a nice subtle cyan to maybe a little darker cyan. Something like that. Click OK, and now I've got a gradient swatch to work with. Now you may have noticed, I'll double click on that so we can look at this dialog box again. You may have noticed that there's no way to adjust the angle of my gradient in this dialog box. That's kind of annoying. How would I change this so that it's not just left to right? Well, we need to apply a local override for our gradient, and there's two ways to do that. The first way is with the gradient panel. So I'll click on the gradient panel over here, and we can see we have all kinds of control, including angle. If I change this to, let's say, 45 degrees, you can see that I get a diagonal angle. If I set it to 90 degrees, it rotates it so that it goes from bottom to top. If I wanted to reverse that, I could type in minus 90 degrees, or I could just click the reverse button. I also get a gradient ramp that looks just like that dialog box, and I can control these just by dragging them around. If I want to have a little bit more of the dark color, I just drag that over a little bit more. I could even change this from a linear to a radial. Now, even though I've done this, the swatch stays the same. I've simply applied a local override to this particular object. Something else you should know about this gradient panel, I'll pull it out here so that we can see both the gradient panel and the color panel at the same time, and we can see that they kind of work in conjunction. For example, I can click on a gradient stop down here, and then change the color up here. Let's make it a little bit more blue or a little bit more purplish. I could even go down here and create another stop on my blend if I wanted to, and I could even make that even more purple. So you have a lot of control right here in the gradient panel as well. And even better, once you get an effect you like, open up your swatches panel and just drag from this little icon in the gradient panel right into the swatches panel. So now it's saved that out as a swatch. Now the other way to fine-tune my gradients is with the gradient tool, which we can find right here in the tool panel. If I select the gradient tool, I can come over here and click and drag to set the beginning and ending points of my gradient. For example, if I click here and drag to over here, you'll see that the radial blend actually moved. Or I could click down here and drag up here, and it extended. It looks almost diagonal now. You have a lot of control over your gradients. Same thing works if this were a linear blend. I'll change that to linear, and we can click and drag to get any kind of effect we want. Start and end points. Now I'm going to talk about applying gradients to text for a moment. So I'll grab the type tool, I'll come over here and select this text, and I'll zoom into 200% with Command 2 or Control 2 on Windows. I'm going to select this text, and I'm going to tell it to fill with a gradient. So the fill icon is on top. I'll go down here and click on my gradient swatch. When I click off, we can see that the gradient has been applied to the fill. But something strange about this, I don't know if you can tell, but the blend doesn't go across the entire range of the text. And if I zoom back, you can see what's going on. When you apply a gradient text, what really happens is that it thinks you are applying it to the entire width of the text frame. So it's not just the text that's selected, it's the entire width of the text frame, but it only shows up in the text. I don't know, I think it's a little bit weird, but that's the way it works. So, if I want to apply it just to this one word, I have to select that, and then use the gradient tool to drag across just that word. I'll hold down the Shift key to make sure it stays straight across, and when I let go and click off, you'll see that now I get the full gradient across just that word. Let's try a different effect. I'll grab the Type tool again, select my word, and with the gradient tool, drag from bottom to top. Now I've filled that with a gradient that goes from bottom to top. But why don't I also give it a stroke gradient? Remember, you can stroke with gradients too. So I'll click the stroke icon, choose my gradient, and then why don't I bump up the thickness of that stroke a little bit so we can see it. Now when I click off, you'll be able to see that I have two gradients, one going on the fill and one going on the stroke. I don't know if this is an effect you want, but it sure is nice to know that you can do this kind of thing. Many designers, especially those who've been in the biz for a while, are accustomed to using a technique called overprinting. For example, they might take a frame, and I'll just drag out a rectangle here, and I'll fill it with a color. Let's say fill it with yellow. And then they set it to overprint. The way you set things to overprint in InDesign is you go to the Window menu and you choose Attributes to open the Attributes panel. The Attributes panel lets you overprint a fill or a stroke, if you have a stroke on the object, which this does. In this case, I'm going to overprint the fill. Unfortunately, I can't see the effect on here, so it looks like nothing happened. But I will have an effect when I actually print the document. When I print separations, this yellow will appear to blend into the background. But what's the use if I can't see it? Well, fortunately, you can see it, but you just have to go to the View menu and turn on Overprint Preview. Now I can see what the final effect is going to look like. Overprint Preview really should be called Make the whole document look a little bit closer to what it's finally going to look like. It just works a little bit harder at being accurate, but it's a little bit more calculation intensive, so on a slower machine, you might not want to actually be working in Overprint Preview mode. To be honest, I hardly ever use Overprint anymore, and the reason is I use the transparency effects instead to get pretty much the same effect. So I'm going to turn off Overprint Fill to show you that. I go to the Effects panel, I choose Multiply from the Blending pop-up menu here, and I get something that looks pretty much the same, and in fact in many cases it's exactly the same. Whether it's a process color or a Pantone color that's overprinting, it looks like it's blending into the background. Even if I turn off the View Overprint here, I still see the effect. There's nothing really technically wrong with overprinting, I just think that the multiply feature is easier, more intuitive, and ultimately it's more flexible and powerful, so that's what I use. Here's the workflow that I became accustomed to over many years of production work in Quark Express. First do a layout, and then print a proof, and then go back and make a few changes, and then print a few more proofs and a few more changes. Finally, I used to print out color separations on really thin paper, and I'd hold them up to the light to make sure the right inks were going to end up on the right place. So let's just say I'm pleased, perhaps very pleased, to not have to do that anymore. Because in InDesign, I can see my separations right on screen. Yes, that's true. InDesign has a built-in PostScript rip and can actually do separations on the fly to the screen. Let me show you. The trick is to go to the Window menu and choose from the Output submenu, Separations Preview. I love this feature. Separations Preview is turned off by default, but if I change the View pop-up menu to Separations, everything gets a little bit better. The reason it gets better is because you're in Overprint Preview mode automatically here. Now, look at what's going on in the Separations panel here. I see all of the different inks that are going to print out in this document. In this document, I don't currently have any spot colors, so I just see CMYK inks. And I can see what each one of those places is going to look like simply by clicking on it. There's the cyan plate, there's the magenta plate, there's yellow, and there's black. That's my black plate. Isn't that great? Now, if I go and add a spot color to this document, for example, I'll just go to the swatches panel and say, give me a new color swatch, and I'll make it a spot color. I'll just grab any random spot color here. Maybe one of these blue Pantone colors. Click OK, and I'm going to apply that spot color to this object. So I've filled this object with that spot color. Now look what's going on in the separations panel. I can see that I've got cyan, magenta, yellow, black, plus this Pantone color, which unfortunately is too close to the background color, but it still will actually print out on its own plate, and I can see that by clicking on it. That's going to be my Pantone plate. And underneath it, you can see that it's actually going to knock out a little bit of the cyan. Now, the reason why you still see a little bit of cyan behind it, and some of these other colors as well, is because the Pantone color had a transparency effect on it, so I could actually see through that Pantone color. Now, if that's all that the Separations Preview panel did, it would still be amazing. I would love it. But this is even better. Watch what happens to the Separations Preview panel here when I start scrolling on top of my document. I place the cursor on top of this color and look to the right of the color names in the Separations Preview panel. You see, I get an actual real-time densitometer reading that tells me exactly how much ink there is under the cursor. If I go on top of this image, I can see the actual readings change depending where I am. If I come over here, I can see that now in this area I've got some Pantone color as well. You see, as I scroll around, I see the CMYK colors and the Pantone colors change. Isn't that mind-blowing? Isn't that just amazing? Well, look, now that we've got a good idea how this file is going to print, I feel comfortable exporting the file as a PDF or sending it off to press. And those are the two topics that we're going to be talking about in the next chapters.